How important is having a family for you?
It's very important. I think what else is for me? It's like that's the reason I'm here.
For 3 decades, the world believed they knew why the most beautiful couple in Hollywood history collapsed. When Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford eloped in Las Vegas with aluminum foil rings, it was the ultimate fairy tale, the Buddhist movie star and the global supermodel. But when it ended just 4 years later, the explanation was always the age gap or busy schedules. Now, 30 years later, the silence has finally been broken. Richard Gere has stepped out of the shadows to reveal the visceral, private struggle that occurred behind closed doors. A revelation that suggests their marriage wasn't just a romance, but a high-stakes psychological battle that neither was prepared to win. What he finally admitted changes everything we thought we knew about their final days together. There are love stories, and then there are love stories that the entire world decides to own. The moment Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford appeared together publicly for the first time, something shifted in the cultural atmosphere. Not just in Hollywood, everywhere. Because what people were looking at wasn't simply a famous couple. It was a specific kind of dream made flesh, the idea that beauty and intellect, glamour and depth could find each other and hold on. That two people operating at the absolute pinnacle of their respective worlds could somehow choose each other and make it work. The world decided, collectively and immediately, that they were meant to be. And that decision, it turns out, put an almost unbearable weight on two people who were still figuring out whether they actually knew each other at all. They met in 1987 at a backyard barbecue, the kind of casual, sun-drenched Hollywood gathering that sounds impossibly cinematic in retrospect. Gere was 40 years old, already cemented as one of the most magnetic leading men in the world following American Gigolo and An Officer and a Gentleman. Crawford was 21. A rising force in the modeling world whose face had already become synonymous with a particular brand of American beauty that transcended fashion and entered mythology. The 17-year age gap was impossible to ignore. Nobody ignored it. But in the moment of that first meeting, it appeared to matter to no one less than it mattered to them. The attraction was immediate and, by all accounts, completely consuming. Friends who were present at that gathering later described the energy between them as almost gravitational, the kind of pull that makes observers simultaneously delighted and slightly nervous. They dated quietly for several years before making the decision that surprised everyone, including, by some accounts, themselves. In December of 1991, Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford eloped to Las Vegas. The rings, famously, were fashioned from aluminum foil. There was no grand ceremony, no industry spectacle, no carefully coordinated press release. Just two people in a Las Vegas wedding chapel making a promise to each other in the most deliberately unpretentious way imaginable. The public absolutely adored it. The aluminum foil rings became the detail everyone repeated. A symbol of romantic spontaneity, of two extraordinarily wealthy and famous people choosing simplicity over spectacle. It was interpreted as proof that what they had was real. Genuine, unperformable. But here is what the aluminum foil rings actually represented, when examined more honestly. They represented a marriage entered into with the speed of impulse rather than the deliberateness of deep understanding. Two people who had dated across years of busy, separate, globe-spanning careers that left precious little time for the slow, unglamorous work of truly learning another human being. They were, in the most fundamental sense, still strangers when they said I do. And the gap between who they each imagined the other person to be and who they actually were, that gap would spend the next 4 years widening into something neither aluminum foil nor Hollywood magic could bridge. Because behind the covers of Vogue and the red carpets of Hollywood premieres, a very specific and very human disagreement was already taking root. A disagreement not about fidelity or ambition or lifestyle, but about something far more foundational. Every marriage has an invisible architecture, a structure of assumptions, expectations, and unspoken agreements that gets built in the early days and then lived in for the duration. Most couples never consciously examine that architecture. They simply inhabit it, until the day a wall cracks or a ceiling collapses and they're suddenly forced to confront what the whole thing was actually built on. For Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford, the invisible architecture of their marriage was constructed on a foundation that made perfect sense in 1991, and became increasingly unstable with every passing month afterward. When they married, the dynamic appeared straightforward to outside observers. Gere was the established star, the Oscar-nominated, globally recognized leading man with 2 decades of industry credibility and a philosophical depth that set him apart from every other actor of his generation. Crawford was luminous and ascending, already famous, already stunning, but still operating in the earlier chapters of what would become a genuinely extraordinary career. The assumption, never stated openly but absolutely present, was that Gere was the gravitational center of the marriage. The elder, the guide, the one with the established world that Crawford was, in some sense, entering. That assumption began dissolving almost immediately after the wedding, because Cindy Crawford in the early 1990s was not simply a model. She was becoming something the entertainment and fashion industries had never quite seen before, a fully realized personal brand at a moment when that concept barely existed. Her MTV show House of Style launched her into a completely different cultural stratosphere. Her workout videos sold in numbers that defied expectation. Her face was on the cover of virtually every major publication in the Western world simultaneously. She was negotiating her own contracts, developing her own television projects, building the infrastructure of a commercial empire with a business intelligence that consistently surprised people who had underestimated her. By 1992, the power dynamic that had quietly underpinned their marriage had not just shifted, it had effectively reversed. Crawford was, by almost any measurable cultural metric, the more publicly prominent figure in the relationship. And while Gere was secure enough in his own identity to avoid outright jealousy, the recalibration created a friction that neither of them had anticipated or prepared for. Former associates close to the couple during this period have described a specific tension that emerged around public appearances and media obligations. Gere was intensely private by nature, a man who found the performance of celebrity genuinely distasteful, and who had long since developed a carefully constructed barrier between his public image and his actual interior life. Crawford, by contrast, was in a season of her career that required maximum visibility, presence, engagement. The machinery of her rising empire ran on public attention, and retreating from that attention wasn't a philosophical choice. It was a professional impossibility. So they began navigating their shared life from fundamentally incompatible positions. He was pulling toward privacy and stillness. She was being pulled by ambition, by momentum, by the sheer velocity of her own ascent, toward visibility and motion. And into that widening space between them came a moment. A specific, documented confrontation that people close to the couple have referenced carefully over the years without ever fully describing it. An ultimatum issued quietly but unmistakably, that forced both of them to choose between the marriage they had and the lives they were individually becoming. What that ultimatum contained and who delivered it is far more complicated than anything the tabloids ever suggested. About what exactly this marriage was supposed to be for to understand the marriage of Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford, you have to understand that you are dealing with 2 people who were not simply different in personality or temperament. You are dealing with 2 people who had constructed entirely different relationships with the concept of existence itself. Richard Gere's devotion to Tibetan Buddhism was not a celebrity hobby. It was not the kind of fashionable Eastern spirituality that Hollywood adopted briefly in the 1990s before moving on to the next trend. It was a total, consuming, decades-long commitment that shaped every dimension of his life. His career choices, his politics, his daily routine, his relationship with silence, his fundamental understanding of what a human life was supposed to look like and what it was supposed to accomplish. He had been a practicing Buddhist since the late 1970s. He had a personal relationship with the Dalai Lama that preceded his biggest films and outlasted his biggest relationships. He meditated for hours daily. He took extended trips to India and Nepal not as vacations but as spiritual obligations, immersive retreats that required complete disconnection from the noise and velocity of the world he otherwise inhabited. This was not a part of Richard Gere. This was Richard Gere. Cindy Crawford, to her enormous credit, did not dismiss this. She engaged with it genuinely and earnestly in the early years of the marriage. She accompanied him on trips. She sat in meditation. She read the texts he recommended and participated in the conversations that mattered most to him. By multiple accounts, she made a sincere and sustained effort to inhabit his spiritual world because she loved him and because she understood that his spirituality was inseparable from the man she had married. But there is a difference between visiting someone's inner world and being able to live there permanently. And over time, a painful realization began to crystallize for Cindy. The version of life that Richard's Buddhism pointed toward, contemplative, restrained, deliberately stripped of material attachment, oriented toward service and spiritual development rather than achievement and accumulation, was not simply different from the life she was building. It was, in a very real sense, a direct philosophical challenge to it. Because Cindy Crawford was building a brand. Consciously, brilliantly, and without apology. She was constructing an empire rooted in beauty, commerce, visibility, and the strategic leveraging of her own image. There was nothing wrong with that. It was genuinely impressive. But it existed in a state of fundamental tension with a worldview that regarded attachment to image and material success as the primary obstacles to human liberation. Richard never issued ultimatums about her career. He was too emotionally intelligent and too spiritually developed for that kind of overt control. But the quieter pressure of his worldview, the implicit suggestion, present in every meditation session and every trip to the Himalayas, that the life she was choosing was oriented in the wrong direction, accumulated in ways that were impossible to live with indefinitely. Former friends of the couple have described dinners where the conversation would drift into philosophical territory that left Cindy visibly uncomfortable. Not because she was intellectually incapable of engaging. She was sharp, curious, and genuinely thoughtful. But because the philosophical framework being offered consistently implied that the things she valued most were, at their core, illusions worth releasing. Being told repeatedly, however gently, that your life's work is an attachment to be surrendered is not a sustainable marital dynamic. But here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody anticipated. Because the spiritual divide, real and significant as it was, turned out not to be the primary architect of their destruction. There was something else operating in the background of their marriage. Something neither philosophy nor career ambition nor age gap could fully explain. Presence. External, intrusive, and ultimately impossible to ignore. And it had nothing to do with another person in the romantic sense. What invaded the most intimate spaces of their marriage was something far stranger, far more public, and far more damaging than a conventional affair. There are moments in a marriage that function like fault lines, invisible on the surface, running silently beneath everything, until the pressure builds to a point where the ground itself splits open. For Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford, that fault line had a name. It had a publication date. It had a price tag. And it appeared, in black and white, in the pages of the London Times on May 6, 1994. The full-page advertisement was extraordinary by any standard. Two of the most recognizable human beings on the planet, paying to publish a statement declaring themselves heterosexual and monogamous. Not in response to a court case. Not in response to a documented scandal. In response to rumors, whisper campaigns, the kind of gossip that traveled through Hollywood's inner circles and eventually found its way into British tabloids with the particular viciousness that British tabloids have always specialized in. The rumors about Richard Gere's sexuality had been circulating for years before the ad appeared. In the hothouse atmosphere of 1980s and early 1990s Hollywood, whisper networks carried stories with extraordinary speed and absolutely no accountability. Gere's intense privacy, his refusal to perform conventional masculinity for the press, his Buddhist spirituality, his selective interview style, all of it was fed into the rumor machine and processed into speculation about his private life that had no factual basis but proved remarkably difficult to extinguish. The decision to take out the ad has been analyzed endlessly in the decades since. On the surface, it appeared to be a united front, a power couple refusing to be defined by tabloid fabrication. But beneath the surface, the reality of what that ad represented was considerably more complicated and considerably more damaging. Because placing that advertisement required Cindy Crawford to publicly defend the intimacy of her own marriage in a way that no person should ever be required to do. It required her to stand in the pages of a major international newspaper and essentially argue for the authenticity of her own romantic life. At 28 years old, at the absolute peak of her global prominence, she was being asked to prove something that should have required no proof to anyone. People close to Crawford during this period have described her private reaction to the entire episode as a combination of anger and exhaustion that went far deeper than the specific incident itself. The anger was understandable. Being forced to defend your marriage publicly is a violation of a particular kind, regardless of the circumstances. But the exhaustion was more revealing, because it spoke to a cumulative fatigue that had been building long before the London Times ad ever ran. The ad didn't create a problem in their marriage. It illuminated one that already existed, because what the entire episode exposed, in the starkest possible terms, was the degree to which outside forces had been given access to the most private architecture of their relationship. The rumor mill, the tabloid press, the public's insatiable appetite for information about two people who had never asked to become the world's most scrutinized couple. All of it had been seeping through the walls of their marriage for years, corroding the intimacy from the inside. Richard Gere, by his own later admission, handled the pressure of that period with characteristic retreat. His instinct, when the external world became unbearably intrusive, was to go deeper into silence, deeper into his practice, deeper into the interior spaces where the noise couldn't reach him. For a man of his temperament, that was a legitimate and genuinely effective coping mechanism. For Cindy Crawford, watching her husband disappear into silence precisely when she needed him most present, it was something altogether different. It was lonely in a way that is almost impossible to articulate. And loneliness, sustained long enough inside a marriage, does not simply coexist with love. It begins quietly and methodically to replace it. The ad ran in May of 1994. The divorce was announced in December of the same year. That 7-month timeline is not a coincidence. Because between the public declaration of their unity and the private acknowledgement of their dissolution, something happened. A specific moment of reckoning, behind closed doors, away from cameras and tabloids and full-page advertisements. A moment where the performance finally stopped and two people looked at each other with complete honesty, possibly for the first time. What they saw when they looked that clearly turned out to be the thing that ended everything. There is a particular cruelty in the final months of a marriage that both people already know is ending. The routines continue. The public appearances are maintained. The smiles are deployed with practiced precision at exactly the right moments. But underneath all of it, in the private hours and the quiet spaces that no camera ever reaches, two people are conducting a silent, exhausting negotiation with a truth they aren't quite ready to speak out loud. For Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford, those final months of 1994 carried that particular weight. The London Times ad had not saved anything. It had simply postponed a conversation that was becoming increasingly impossible to avoid. And as the year moved toward its close, the geography of their shared life told its own story. Two people spending more time in separate cities, separate commitments, separate versions of a future that were growing less compatible by the week. People who were close to both of them during this period have described a marriage in its final phase not with drama, but with something far sadder. A kind of mutual, exhausted tenderness. Two people who genuinely cared for each other, who had not stopped loving each other in the fundamental sense, but who had arrived at the devastating recognition that love, by itself, was not a sufficient architecture for the life they were each trying to build. Cindy Crawford has spoken in interviews across the years about a friendship versus passion dynamic that she struggled to define but clearly felt deeply. The implication, carefully worded and never quite directly stated, was that the marriage had evolved into something that felt more like a profound companionship than a fully realized romantic partnership. That the fire which had made their connection so immediately compelling in 1987 had not so much burned out as transformed into something quieter, warmer, and ultimately insufficient for two people still in the electric middle of their lives. Richard Gere's own reflections, offered sparingly and always with the careful deliberateness of a man who chooses every word with intention, have pointed toward a different dimension of the same reality. He has spoken about his own limitations as a partner during that period, his emotional unavailability, his tendency toward withdrawal, his preference for internal processing over the kind of open, vulnerable communication that a marriage requires to remain truly alive. What emerges from both sets of reflections, considered together, is the portrait of a breaking point that didn't announce itself with a single dramatic event. It arrived the way most real endings arrive, gradually, then suddenly, in a moment of quiet clarity that felt less like a decision and more like an acknowledgement of something that had already happened. That moment, by multiple accounts, occurred during a rare period when both of them were in the same place at the same time, without the buffer of professional obligations or social engagements to fill the silence between them. Private evening. A conversation that began ordinarily and then, without either of them fully intending it, became the most honest exchange they had shared in months. What was said in that conversation has never been fully disclosed. Both Gere and Crawford have honored a mutual commitment to privacy around the specific details of their final days together. A commitment that speaks well of them both and has held remarkably firm for 3 decades. But the contours of that conversation can be mapped from what each of them has said in its aftermath. It was not a fight. There was no defining betrayal revealed, no ultimatum issued, no door slammed. What happened instead was something more quietly devastating. 2 people telling each other the truth about who they were and what they needed, and discovering in the process that the answers no longer aligned. The divorce was filed shortly afterward. The statement released to the press was brief, dignified, and carefully constructed to reveal as little as possible. The world received the news with the particular collective disappointment that only accompanies the end of a relationship people had emotionally invested in as though it were their own. But before the lawyers were called and before the statement was drafted, a pact was made. An agreement between 2 people who had loved each other genuinely and who owed each other, at minimum, the protection of their shared privacy. A promise to keep the specific truth of what had broken them hidden from public consumption, not out of shame, but out of respect. That pact held for 30 years, until Richard Gere decided, finally, that the truth deserved to breathe. And what he said when he broke that silence was not what anyone expected to hear. There is a specific kind of freedom that only arrives with age. Not the freedom of youth, that reckless, unearned confidence that mistakes inexperience for liberation. Something deeper and harder one. The freedom of a person who has lived long enough and honestly enough to look back at the most complicated chapters of their life without flinching. To name things that once felt unnameable. To offer truth not as confession or self-justification, but simply as the final, overdue act of respect for everything that happened. Richard Gere found that freedom somewhere in his 70s. And when he began speaking carefully, selectively, but with a new and unmistakable openness, about his marriage to Cindy Crawford, the world leaned in with 30 years of accumulated curiosity and listened. The context of his revelations matters enormously. Gere's current life looks almost nothing like the one he was living during the Crawford years. At 74, he is married to Alejandra Silva, a Spanish activist and publicist 33 years his junior, with whom he shares a warmth and domestic contentment that radiates from every public appearance they make together. They have children. They have built what appears to be a genuinely peaceful, mutually nourishing partnership. And it is precisely from the security of that contentment that Gere has been able to look backward without defensiveness. In recent interviews, conducted with the measured thoughtfulness that has always characterized his public communication, Gere has offered reflections on the Crawford marriage that are notable for their absence of deflection. He has not blamed the age gap. He has not cited scheduling conflicts or career pressures. He has not retreated into the comfortable vagueness that celebrities typically deploy when discussing failed relationships. Instead, he has done something considerably braver. He has pointed the examination inward. Gere has spoken openly about what he now recognizes as a profound emotional unavailability during his marriage to Crawford, about a pattern of withdrawal into his practice, into his work, into the interior silence that Buddhism had taught him to value, that left his partner consistently, repeatedly, and unfairly alone in the emotional center of their shared life. He has described himself during that period as a man who was genuinely loving but functionally absent, present in the physical sense, but unreachable in the ways that matter most to a person who needs to feel truly known by their partner. The honesty of that self-assessment is striking. It is also, for those who followed the marriage closely, deeply illuminating, because it confirms what Crawford's own carefully worded reflections had long implied without directly stating, that she was not, in the ways that counted, truly seen inside that marriage, that the man she had married was always, in some essential part of himself, somewhere else. Crawford's response to Gere's recent openness has been equally revealing in its own quiet way. She has not disputed his characterizations. She has not rushed to offer counter-narratives or public corrections. In her own interviews, She has spoken about the Crawford-Gere years with a reflective sadness that is entirely free of bitterness, describing a relationship that was real and meaningful and ultimately insufficient, all at the same time. What has emerged from both of their recent reflections, taken together and read carefully, is something that 30 years of tabloid speculation never managed to produce. An honest portrait of two genuinely good people who were wrong for each other in ways that neither of them had the tools or the self-knowledge to fully recognize at the time. But there is one element of Gere's recent admissions that has generated more quiet conversation than anything else he has said. One specific acknowledgement about the nature of his behavior inside the marriage. Not his spirituality, not his privacy, not his emotional withdrawal, but something more targeted, more personal, more revealing about the specific dynamic that existed between them. An admission about control, about the subtle, persistent, and ultimately destructive way he had attempted to shape Cindy Crawford into a version of herself that better fit the life he had already decided he wanted to live. And that admission leads directly to the one truth about their marriage that 30 years of silence was specifically designed to protect. There is a form of control that never raises its voice. It doesn't issue demands or deliver ultimatums or announce itself with any of the recognizable signals that people associate with a controlling relationship. It operates far more quietly than that. It works through suggestion and expectation and the slow, gentle but relentless pressure of a vision, one person's vision of what the relationship should look like, what the partner should prioritize, who the partner should fundamentally be, pressed against another person's emerging sense of self until something eventually gives way. This is what Richard Gere, in his most unguarded recent moments, has essentially described doing to Cindy Crawford. Not maliciously, not consciously, at least not in the beginning, but persistently and consequentially nonetheless. Gere has acknowledged, in the careful, philosophically precise language that characterizes everything he says, that he entered the marriage with a fully formed idea of the life he wanted. A life oriented around spiritual practice, purposeful simplicity, meaningful work, and a deliberate withdrawal from the more performative aspects of celebrity culture. It was a beautiful vision. It was an authentic vision. It was entirely, unapologetically his vision. And the problem, the specific, corrosive, marriage-ending problem, was that he had expected Cindy Crawford to inhabit it with him. Not through force. Through something subtler and in some ways more suffocating. Through the quiet but constant implication that the life she was building, the brand, the visibility, the commercial empire, the MTV appearances and the workout videos and the magazine covers, represented a set of values that were, within his philosophical framework, lesser. Attachments to be released rather than achievements to be celebrated. He was, in effect, asking her to become a quieter, smaller, more spiritually oriented version of herself. And he was asking it not with words, but with the daily atmospheric pressure of simply being Richard Gere, a man whose entire presence implied a particular hierarchy of what mattered and what didn't. Cindy Crawford, to her profound credit, eventually recognized what was happening. And her response was not anger or confrontation. It was something more powerful and more permanent. She simply refused. She chose herself, her ambitions, her identity, her own unfolding vision of who Cindy Crawford was supposed to become, over the version of herself that the marriage was quietly but insistently requesting. That choice, Gere has now acknowledged, was exactly right. And his ability to say that clearly, without qualification 30 years later, represents perhaps the most significant spiritual growth of his entire life. Because the man who spent their marriage gently trying to reshape Cindy Crawford has arrived, finally, at the understanding that she never needed reshaping. That the qualities he unconsciously sought to moderate, the ambition, the visibility, the fierce commercial intelligence, the refusal to shrink, were not obstacles to her best self. They were her best self. And the question Cindy asked him on the night she left, the question he could not answer then, the question that has lived in the unspoken space between them for 3 decades, was simply this: do you actually see me? Not the version of me you want. Not the quieter, softer, more contemplative person you've been hoping I'll become. Me, as I actually am. He couldn't answer that night. The honesty required to say no, to acknowledge that he had been loving an idea of her rather than the full, complicated, extraordinary reality of her, was beyond what he was capable of in that moment. It took him 30 years to find the words. 30 years of building a different kind of self. A man who learned, through subsequent reflection and subsequent love, that the greatest act of devotion is not trying to make someone fit your life. It is being willing to truly see the life they are already living. Cindy Crawford went on to build one of the most successful personal brands in entertainment history. She married Rand Gerber, raised a family, and constructed a legacy that exists entirely on her own terms. By every visible measure, she became exactly who she was always going to become, with or without anyone's permission. Richard Gere found his own contentment, his own peace, his own version of love that fits him rather than requiring him to fit it. But the marriage they shared, for imperfect, complicated, genuinely felt years, was not a failure. It was something more instructive and more human than failure. It was two people discovering, at great emotional cost, the difference between loving someone and truly seeing them. And in the end, that distinction is everything. It is the whole story. It always was. Just when we thought the story was settled, Richard Gere alluded to one specific question Cindy asked him the night she walked out. A question he couldn't answer then, but finally found the words for 3 decades later. What was that final, devastating inquiry, and how does it redefine the entire legacy of their 4-year marriage?